Hey guys, welcome back to the console Stackup. Today we're going to be looking at the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System. Alright. The Sega Genesis video series is over with, and with that, it's time to take a look at its competitor, the NES. But the NES isn't just any old console. The history surrounding this piece of hardware is paramount in understanding why it became an icon in the video game industry. For example, did you know that the NES wasn't always called the NES, and was actually an entirely different console and was changed in order to serve the American market? So think of this video as an introduction, which will be followed by a look at hardware, the popular games, sales, marketing, and a legal analysis of the console. When all these videos are done, I will compare everything that makes this console what it is with the Sega Genesis to see just how well it stacks up. This gray box is a landmark achievement in video game history. It not only single-handedly revived a dying industry, but also became one of the best-selling and most beloved consoles of all time. But you're probably asking yourself, why? How in the world did this boxy-looking VCR toaster manage to fly into a third of all US homes and dominate 90% of the world's video game market uncontested for nearly a decade? Well, in order to understand the NES, which was released in 1985, we need to take a slight step backwards to see its initial unveiling in Japan 2 years prior. 1983 marked the year of the video game crash in the United States. However, this phenomenon was only a North American event. The rest of the world had barely been affected, and business ran normally. In fact, Japan was the leading forefront in video game innovation during this gaming depression, and had it not been for them, the modern industry could have looked very different. Cue the introduction of Nintendo's newest product, the Famicom. The name being a simplified version of Family Computer, the Famicom was Nintendo's attempt to enter the home video game market. They had a few forays with a TV game series, but that is a video for another time. So you are probably asking yourself, how did Nintendo decide to make such a weird little thing? Well, Nintendo was divided into 3 R&D groups, and all their efforts at the time were aimed at creating a new console and technology. R&D 1 would create hit games like Mario Bros, Zelda, and Metroid. R&D 2 would create the NES architecture, and R&D 3 would work on creating the NROM chips, which allowed each game greater power and data capacity, which was vital in order to play some of the bigger NES games. This is super important, so we'll get into this later. The Famicom system was primarily created by Nintendo's R&D 2 team, and he had strict guidelines when creating it. Not only did it have to be cheaper than its competition, which included the MSX2 and the Intellivision, it had to be technically superior as well, while maintaining a $75 price point. Nintendo originally thought on using a 16-bit CPU, like other computers were using at the time, but decided to opt for the 8-bit 6500 series processor, which was developed in 1975, in order to save cost. However, this chip was not enough to power the NES alone, so a second chip was introduced, which would be called the Picture Processing Unit, or PPU, also made by Ricoh. We'll look more into the chips used when we dissect the NES in the hardware section. The design of the original Famicom looks a tad childish to say the least. The idea when creating it was to invoke the idea of a game machine and not a computer. Thus, any notions of a keyboard, mouse, or floppy drive were dropped. The colors and design was chosen to emulate the look of a toy, and in order to further cut down on costs, controllers were actually hardwired in, though they did leave a third slot open in the front to house an additional controller or peripheral. On the topic of controllers, the original Famicom controller was originally going to have an arcade stick as the primary directional control, but again, in an effort to save costs, they instead opted to adopt their older Game & Watch D-pads, which quickly became the standard. The original system also output through an RF connection. The console also had cartridge slots, which had 60 pins to connect to games. The Famicom went on to sell over 1 million units in its first year, and Nintendo decided to spread their success across the globe, starting with America. Nintendo saw the dilapidated US market as both a proving ground and an uncontested market to grab a hold of. But transferring the Famicom to appeal to US markets came with a slew of changes, which were mostly cosmetic, with a handful of hardware changes as well. Alright, time for the next fun fact. In order to appeal to various groups, Nintendo published a controller for quadriplegic users. It was an absolute hit, and the press loved it. Surprisingly, the controller apparently worked rather well. A lever hooked to a device one would put under their chin to control movement, and a straw would be inserted into the user's mouth to control action. Sipping was B, and blowing was A. Today, this controller runs anywhere from $600 to $800 depending on condition. To get a rough idea of the crash, we're talking about a nearly $3 billion industry who was controlled by Intel, Coleco, and Mattel during the late 70s and early 80s. However, by 1983, there was such an influx of bad games that the $3 billion market shrank by 95%. Thus, the billions of dollars taken from the home console market was funneled into arcades via quarters. When Nintendo came to America in order to sell their product, no company wanted anything to do with this toy-looking piece of hardware with the memory of the game crash still in their recent memories. Nintendo's only bet was to revamp the cosmetics and display it at the Winter '84 Consumer Electronics Show. The CES was an electronic trade show held twice yearly to display all the newest and hottest pieces of tech. In order to appeal to the US market, which was at the time experiencing a wave of interest in computer technologies, they developed a keyboard, a music keyboard, a zapper gun, a mouse, and a tape player. Lance Barr was assigned to modify the aesthetics of the console to more closely replicate other major trends in the industry, similar to the VIC-20 and C64. They also decided that a name change was in order and decided on the AVS, Advanced Video Game System. The AVS would also address the issue of counterfeit software, which was running rampant in Asia. The idea was to add a chip in the AVS that would look for a corresponding chip in the game cartridge. If the chip in the cartridge had a working code that corresponded with the chip in the system, then the game would play normally. If not, the system would freeze. The chip would be called the 10 NES lockout security chip, and only Nintendo retained the rights and patent to the code. Now, the primary reason to create this chip was to ensure that only quality games published by Nintendo would be released for the console. I'll go more in depth in later videos, but the general consensus was this. The video game crash was caused by an influx of poorly written and designed games. Majority of the money companies had spent was towards marketing and ads, so initially, sales were very high for these games. But as time went on, consumers lost faith in the industry, and subsequently stopped buying the games no matter how good the marketing was. In the long run, it turned into bad games equals low profits. And honestly, if modern developers and companies don't take notice, another crash may soon be coming. With these changes in place, the AVS was featured at 2 consumer electronics shows. While various individuals at the shows commented on the console, nobody wanted to take a chance on it with the fresh memory of the crash in their wake. Thus, Arakawa, who was the president of the American branch of Nintendo, and who was also the president of Japan's son-in-law, had decided to revamp the console, making it basic in order to appeal to kids. He threw out the piano, the keyboard, and the mouse, and sent R&D Team 1 to work on some sort of peripheral. If a game console by itself wasn't enough to sell, then adding a new nifty toy to the mix would surely entice consumers. The result was Rob, the robotic operating buddy, which was used to play a few select games. Arakawa also decided to add a zapper gun. With the aid of Lance Barr and Don James, the guy who picked the initial US market Nintendo games, they redesigned the AVS to the toaster-looking gray box we all know and love today. The first main change included the cosmetic appearance of the console. They redesigned the cart slot in order to mimic a piece of technology you would see at a consumer electronics show. It was meant to emulate a VCR using zero insertion force techniques, which will be gotten more into in the hardware section. The console also added an AV port for better audio and quality. They redesigned the aesthetics of the controllers to match the NES, and also made the controllers detachable instead of being permanently connected. The NES also added 12 pins to the Famicom 60 to make a full 72. Essentially, 2 of these pins were used for the lockout security, and the other 10 were routed to a secret expansion port on the underside, which hosts a lot of good secret goodies. However, this also led to a lot of issues down the line, and the last major change was the alteration from 50 to 60 Hz, or more commonly known as the PAL to NTSC conversion. Now, I won't be looking into Rob, the AVS, or the Famicom. That'll be a video for another time. Now, I've done a lot of research. If you guys want to learn more, I recommend you look at Game Over and The Ultimate History of Video Games, which are great resources. Now, I probably left you with a lot of questions, like what's the difference between PAL and NTSC? What was the NES expansion port? Were there different variations of the NES? To get the answers to these questions and more, I highly recommend you stay tuned to a tube near you to see our NES breakdown. Until then, this is Brando, signing out.